Thank you very much. And there we go. Welcome everyone to the second webinar of the three-part Trauma and System Change webinar series. My name is Alexis Adato. I'm the Special Project Manager at the Wellbeing Project, and I am delighted to be here today with all of you. For the past 3 years, the Wellbeing Project and Georgetown University, with a large group of collaborators from across the world and across disciplines, have explored and researched the subject of trauma and intergenerational trauma. This webinar series is a collaboration with the Collective Change Lab, and it is an exploration of trauma. It centers it at the heart of social change for healing. Today, we will have a dialogue with social change leaders and collective healers to explore how can we move towards healing systems. I'd like to introduce the 4 wonderful speakers that will be in dialogue today. I will keep it short and try to do justice to these wonderful professionals and human beings. Dr. Rana Dajani is a professor of molecular biology at the Hamshmite University in Jordan and a visiting professor at MIT, where she advances our understanding of epigenetics and biomarkers of trauma among refugees. Named one of the 100 most influential Arab women, she has received many prestigious awards and fellowships, including from Ashoka and Schwab Foundation for her work as a social entrepreneur. Dr. Rana's social enterprise, We Love Reading, started in Jordan, and it leverages the healing powers of stories. She has founded more than 4,000 libraries in 60 countries, including in refugee camps. Natalia Quiñones is the co-founder of Duna Foundation in Colombia, a nonprofit created to research, design, and implement evidence-based models to foster peace and integrate ex-combats in the armed conflict back into society. Duna's approach to achieving reconciliation and peaceful coexistence is to create collective space for self-care, emotional regulation, anger management, and empathy, with the goal of strengthening internal resources available to all Colombians for healing. Dr. Maleni Goodchild is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe system thinking and complexity scholar affiliated with the Canadian Association of Science Centers, the Wolf Willow Institute for Systems Learning, the Presencing Institute's Youth School for Transformation, and the Academy for Systems Change. Her focus is on decolonizing system thinking and complexity science. Celina De Sola is the co-founder and president of Glasswing International, an organization awarded by the Obama Foundation, SCOL, the Audacious Project, LEGO, and many others for its innovative approaches to addressing the root causes and consequences of poverty and violence across Central America and beyond through education, mental health, and youth empowerment initiatives. In that work, Celina draws on her decades of experience leading humanitarian responses in Liberia, Chad, Afghanistan, and other countries. Catherine Milligan is a director at the Collective Change Lab, a think tank and action lab focused on how to achieve system change. She is affiliated with many innovation and entrepreneurship networks, including as a long-standing advisor to the Wellbeing Project. And she also teaches courses on social innovation and entrepreneurship, system thinking, and leadership at universities in the US and in Switzerland. So before we dive in, we'd like to express a message of solidarity and commitment to this topic, to the well-being and healing to humanity. We would like to express our support for the many people experiencing deep trauma, fear, and grief who are directly or indirectly affected by the worsening humanitarian crisis currently taking place in Palestine, in Israel, in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Sudan, and Ukraine. We acknowledge this is a difficult time for many, and we stand in solidarity with you. So thank you very much for being part of this conversation. We are thrilled to have you here and be sharing this space with all of you. And I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Malene Goodchild to guide us through an exercise that will help us arrive and be present with our God, heart, and mind through this time together. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodchild.
Miigwech, bojo and dinamamag and a duck, apijago, miigwech bizin davayug, wapshke o gitida kwezanang, indigenous cause, waba anang a kwe indigo and nishnabe mung, mo zindo dem, bigtagong nishnabeg, ijinakade ishkonigan, wenjiayan, gaye kidagon zibi, nindonchi, adash kuchiching nindonchi, adash bawating indaye nungum, Maleni indigenous cause jagana shimung. So I said, greetings to my relatives. Thank you for listening. I'm Maleni. I'm Moose Clan. I shared my two spirit names, and I am Anishinaabe or Ojibwe here on Turtle Island. I said the First Nations that I'm from, Bigtagong, Anishinaabe, Kitigan, Zibi, and Couchiching. Dash, I'm also from Bawating, which is here, the place of the rapids. This is the place of the Three Fires Confederacy, our traditional territory, the Potawatomi, Anishinaabe, and Odawa, which is on Turtle Island, which is North America. And I introduce myself according to those protocols because I call my spirit here with me, because I'm going to lead us first in an opening. This is often how we ground ourselves in a good way, also aware of the topics, aware of how people are arriving. And even on Zoom, you will feel probably the medicines. Some people smell them. And then afterwards, I will share with you an approach that we're taking in Circle Together, which is a gift from our brothers and sisters in Australia, which is yarning. And I've been taught how to yarn by Auntie Vicky Charles and my brother Tyson Young Comporta. And so to begin, there are 4 medicines in our culture. Ijitawewen, Anishinaabe Ijitawewen means our culture. And we call on those 4 medicines. There's also 4 directions. And I'm going to acknowledge those 4 directions and invite the beings that live in those 4 corners. It also represents the 4 great nations, which means all of the humans on Mother Earth. And our 4 medicines are sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, and cedar. And so I just have some sage, because sage is the purification. So I'm gonna, as my colleague often says, spark a sage so we can sage against the machine. For those of us doing systems, he's gonna love that I used his joke. We're gonna sage against the machine. We're going to smudge ourselves. And this is a purification ceremony. It's common in many cultures. And we've been doing this on Zoom for a few years since the pandemic, the big sickness came. And I'm going to light this, but I also have water here. And so in my culture, women are water keepers and men are fire keepers. But in my friend Tyson, his culture, because he's on the other side of the world, the women are fire keepers and the men are water keepers. What's important to understand is that's a teaching of balance, and that in our language, we only have they, we don't have he, she. So we recognize the fluidity and that there's masculine and feminine energy. So I like to have both of them here. Too much water would douse the fire. Too much fire would evaporate. So that's one of our teachings for why we have fire keepers. I'm a traditionally trained apprentice, a shkabe, a helper with our elders that do ceremonies, my auntie doctors people. And so I'm not an elder. I'm a young knowledge keeper. Which is that I've been going to ceremonies for many years now. So I'm going to light this, and what you do if you were here in person is you're smudging your mind for good thoughts, you're smudging your eyes to see clearly, you're smudging your mouth to speak the truth, to speak with kindness, you're smudging your heart to take it all in. And I strongly encourage you to have a cup of tea, a cup of water, eat, do that on camera. In fact, the elders love it when you eat on camera, because all of this is in our blood. And if we want to awaken our connections to each other and to the universe, we say Gedina Windamin, we're all related, then we have to awaken our blood. And so the elders really love it when we are together and that all of our senses are stimulated, and that wakes up all of the teachings in our bloodstream. So I will light this and say a few words, and then you can feel that we are starting in a good way. So when we smudge, we usually take off anything that would get in the way of the medicines. Which Gejemanatoge Mijiang Nishnabe Mino Bamatsawin Migwich Skakamukwe Gemijiayang Nibish Gemijiayang Mijim Seman Nabagdana Ki Wade Nung Wab Nung Zhao Nung Minwa Ninga Bia Nung which Gejemanato Gemijiayang Niswe Gemijiayang Mushkiki Minwa Gemijiayang Mushkiki one again Minawa the Manitou Kewanan. So I said thank you to the Great Mystery, to Gije Manato, and to all those beings in those four directions, the north, south, east, and west. And then I have a helper, Migaze Miguan, an eagle feather. And this eagle feather has the four colors, the four directions, the four great nations, red, white, yellow, black. That represents the four medicines, the four seasons we have here on Turtle Island, the four stages of life, represents the four parts of your being, spirit, mental, physical, emotional, and it represents those four directions and four medicines. So I will smudge myself on behalf of all of us. So we start in a good way and invite those ancestors and those medicines in to be with us. And one of the cultural ways of sharing knowledge is to sit in a circle like this. And the concept that I was introduced to in my studies when I was in a PhD program was Minigo Iziwin. Minigo Iziwin, that which is given to you, Minigo is you win from somebody else, from the past. And so Minigo is you win. We all come here today with our sacred knowledge bundles. We are gathering items for a sacred knowledge bundle when we are in circle together. And one of the nice ways to do that is through a yarn. So Apajigo Miigwech Bizindao, thank you for listening and participating in the opening ceremony. And I'm just going to share my screen very briefly to take you through this teaching. So I mentioned I'm Moose Clan, I'm an Anishinaabe. These are some protocols for having a yarn together. So as I mentioned, my friend and colleague Tyson Young Comporta, he says in his book Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, yarns are like conversations, but take a traditional form we have always used to create and transmit knowledge. Just going to share quickly here that in terms of it's a methodology as well for knowledge production in rituals, ceremonies, protocols, include active listening, mutual respect, and it's about building on what each other has said, not really listening for debate, so that deep listening. The other thing about yarns is they really involve narrative. So you can go off and share a poem and an anecdote, build on what each other. So those of us that have been invited here as panelists that were already introduced, we'll be having a yarn. We'll be sharing stories with each other, experiences from our lived reality, which can include our academic research. It can also include our personal life journeys. And so a yarn is a collective wisdom journey. It opens in a ceremony. You're often drinking tea. Sometimes you're doing crossword puzzles, you're knitting, you're beading, whatever you're comfortable with. I encourage you to do that as you participate, from your computer or phone. It's a formal strategy. It's about safety. It's a holistic methodology, but the important part is that final paragraph there. It's also a metaphorical journey. So in Tyson's culture, they talk about campfires. In my culture, we talk about lodges. And so it's the sacred space between each other's lodge. And so as I'm speaking, you're visiting my lodge. As someone else is speaking, we're all visiting their lodge and I'm visiting their lodge. So we have to have hospitality. It's about kindness. Also, we visit the campsite of the ancestors. That's why we start in ceremony, so that we remember the natural law or original instructions. Here's the 6 main protocols, and this is the final slide. It's a gift, and we're gifting things to each other. So if we were in person, I may offer you all a tobacco tie as a gift for participating in the yarn or something else. It's also the gift of our time today and our respect that we give each other. We control the length of the yarn. This particular yarn is controlled by the length of the Zoom that was scheduled. There's freedom in a yarn. You only have to share what you wish to share. So that goes for the panelists as well. We're really just sharing when we feel like we're going. So we may not answer every question. I've also hosted many yarns where people just listen the whole time. There might be 2 hours and they're just taking so much in, but you can also share. The physical space where it takes place. I've smudged my home here. I love my bookshelf behind me. I feel comfortable here, but often yarning takes place on the land. It takes place in lodges, often around Ishkode fire. And you'll see that's partly why I like starting with a smudge. The striking of that match helps me bring in the spirit of Ishkode. Inclusiveness from an Indigenous perspective, everyone is welcome in the yarning space. And sometimes there are gender specific yarns. And so the personal characteristics of who's in the yarn may determine where the yarn goes. It may be culturally specific, social, gender oriented. It may focus on queer medicine. It really depends on who's participating in the yarn. So that gives you an overview of how we're going to approach today, being in circle together. And I will hand it back to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that beautiful experience to help us fully arrive for this conversation. And thank you, Alexis, for your introduction, and welcome to everyone, our speakers, collaborators, and participants for this conversation about trauma and collective healing and systems. We're delighted to pick up the baton, so to speak, from my colleagues, John Kania and Laura Calderon de la Barca, who facilitated the first webinar in the series and are with us today. And there'll be a third webinar later this week, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But as we get started, as a gentle reminder, this is a 90-minute webinar. We're trying to cover a lot of ground and do justice to complex topics. And we're also trying to create some spaciousness in ourselves and in this conversation. And that means silence is okay and even welcome, and not knowing is also okay. We don't have all the answers, and we really see this more as an invitation to search for answers together. We're trying to spark a conversation by offering some perspectives and stories, as Melanie was just sharing, some practical takeaways, but really this is the starting line. The last thing I'd like to say is that sometimes there can be a temptation to intellectualize discussions around trauma and healing. And that's our MO, that's where we feel comfortable, right? In that rational thinking mind. But we also need to engage our heart and our spirit and our body and make room for pain and overwhelm and sadness and grief, and honor the stories and experiences that our speakers will offer today, but also the collective experience and the stories that each one of you is bringing by virtue of being here in this yarn. So that's just simply an invitation to listen and to engage at all 3 of these levels. And just notice what you are feeling in your body as the conversation unfolds, maybe what emotions and memories are present. And it's also an invitation to care for yourself and resource yourself so that we can stay connected to our shared humanity as we yarn together. And so with that, let's dive into the first round. And in webinar 1, for those of you who weren't able to join us, the speakers presented some definitions of trauma and how it affects us as individuals and organizations and movements for change. And they encouraged us to think really beyond this prevailing individualistic view of trauma, to start seeing and naming different types or layers, if you will, of individual, yes, but intergenerational, historical, and collective trauma that are all around us and inside us and act as powerful forces in our systems. And so we're going to build on that foundation today. And the question that I'd love to, sort of pose and get us started with, and Natalia, it'd be wonderful if you can kick us off, so to speak, is, let's begin with some high level framing messages, right? There are lots of social change leaders in the room, nonprofit leaders, entrepreneurs, government leaders, philanthropy executives, working across different social systems in different geographies, some of whom are doing place-based work also. So a lot of differences, yet what unites us is that we're all trying to make systems work better for everyone, especially those who are the most vulnerable. So what message, would you like to convey, and would each of the speakers would you like to convey about trauma and healing to help us collectively see into a new perspective?
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you also, Melanie, for this much. I could actually smell and feel the sage, which is also the way that we would start a circle here in Colombia. I'm talking to you from Chia, the land of the goddess moon in Muisca territory, in the heart of Colombia. And I can already feel the sense of interconnectedness that the ritual has brought for this conversation. And that is precisely the message that I want to share with you. When we've seen trauma and conflict happen here in Colombia, what we've witnessed is a brokenness of that sense of connection. It's a fragmentation. And it's a fragmentation, like you said, Catherine, on so many different levels, starting on the levels that Melanie called when she started the ritual: the physical, the spiritual, the emotional, the mental. We tend to lose our sense of connection between all those different parts of ourselves when trauma and conflict happens. So the first step to healing is finding again a connection between all of those levels of self. But then again, we also find that there's a loss of connection between ourself with all these layers and others, other humans and other sentient beings in our land, which is very deeply felt here in Colombia. The lack of trust, the closing of doors that used to be open for neighbors, the difficulty of looking at each other in the eye when we meet someone new. And then also there's one more layer, which is, more collective and also more grounded, that we've observed in Colombia. And it has to do with losing a connection with our common mother, Earth, and the land. When conflict and trauma happens, we also feel disconnected to our mother, and that creates a sense of brokenness in the entire system and social tissue that is very difficult to heal if we don't start healing our relationship with the land as well. So my offering as a high-level message to all of you is we need to work at all those layers, at all those levels, to start systems healing after trauma and conflict. Back to you.
Maybe to pick up the yarn from the people who have spoken before me. I think I share what is happening today now as we speak, and from Gaza. The unfolding genocide that we are witnessing, and a colonial settler project that we thought was in the past, whether it's the Native American or what in Australia or others, and yet it is happening now. And to me, what strikes me as we try to understand the complexity of the trauma that is happening. When we would say if this happened while we were alive, we wouldn't let it happen, and yet it is happening on our social media. And when we say never, never again for anyone anywhere in the world, to me, when I speak to the people I'm trying to stay in touch with in Gaza intermittently because of the lack of communication, and I hear their voices of resilience and resistance and the humanity and the care and the love that they share and how they stand, I learn from them so many real-time lessons. And in the context of this meeting, which is so important in the context of what's happening around the world, I ask them, how can we support you, right? We are privileged to speak here about how do we heal from trauma. It is about them who are really going through it. And trauma, as we know from research, is a continuous thing. It's not a one event, one experience, especially in the context of what's happening today. And all they say is that what makes us stronger is knowing that we are not alone, that there are others who stand in solidarity and agree that every human life is important. No, not one life is more valuable than any other. And to speak up and to say what is truth, because that's how we come together to prevent trauma from happening. It's not just about healing, it's can we stop it from starting in the beginning? And so I learned from them, and I speak from that, what they told me, because I asked them, we're going to have this meeting today, what do you want me to share? And in the words of many academic friends, nurses, journalists, just that we ask for solidarity to speak up. And people, and I want to tie this to systems change, that we think that systems change is something big and huge and impossible, but no, it starts small. It starts with each one of us. It starts with each one of us saying one word, and it's the collective that will make the difference on the long run. So I urge you to say the truth, to share what's happening, to speak up, so that we don't leave them alone, since we are witnessing it as we do today. I'll stop there. There's a lot to talk about from a scientific perspective, but I think it is only fitting to witness and share what I was asked to share from my brothers and sisters from Gaza with all of you today.
Thank you so much for that, Rana. And I think you see all the love from people here. We deeply appreciate your elevating those voices and bringing them into this discussion. Selena, can we turn to you?
No, I think from the beginning, right, from Melanie and everything, right, and what Rana just said, Natalia pulling us in together. I think sometimes you feel really, that disconnect intrapersonally, but also just from all of these things, right? So I think these moments are really important, and this kind of coming together is important to remember how connected we are, because the irony of being so connected virtually and so disconnected in a human and personal way, I think is important to remind each other and ourselves and try to find spaces to do that. And I think in our daily lives and just in general, because we all kind of put our heads down and work and try to do try to do the right thing, try to, work to improve conditions, to ensure people have access to opportunities. And sometimes it's even in that we're not really connecting. So I think that what my fellow panelists and friends said before, I'm just kind of taking it in, and I think it's important to do that and just pause. A lot of it resonates a lot with me, and I also think just people and also Mother Earth, like Natalia just underscored before me. So I think as far as the top line, I think it's just, for me at least personally, it's a reminder to remember that connection runs deeper than what seems to be kind of being connected right now, and that energy goes across the world in different ways. So it's important for all of us to be mindful of what we're putting out there in terms of energy and what we say and what we do.
I know we'll circle back to this notion of energy, right? And the relational space between us. Thank you for offering that. Melanie.
Yeah, I think, for an Anishinaabe perspective, we probably experienced trauma, my ancestors, in a very hard life, sustenance life on the land, but trauma really came to the forefront with settler colonialism and after contact, and we have intergenerational trauma, we have scholarship on that, we have, elders, we have medicine people, but part of our Adazukan, which is our sacred teaching about how we came to be here on Mother Earth, what consistent pattern in all of those Adazukanan, which are our legends and stories, is helpers, ashkabewas. And in our cosmology, our way we make sense of the world spiritually, we are spirit beings on a human journey. That's why when I said my two spirit names, I said Waba Anang Ekwe is one of my spirit names, Indigo, Nishtabe Mung. Indigo is what I am called by the spirits in Ojibwe. And so I have those names before I get my English name, Melanie. And when I go back to the spirit world, I will be known by those names and maybe some more, maybe even more names. I have 2 names right now that come in ceremony. And what that teaches us is that for us, the spiritual realm is the most important realm and the physical realm is the second most important, if you want to look at it that way. And so the spirituality is how we connect, and we need helpers to do that because our rational minds, we tend to forget about the spiritual nature of our existence. And so our ancestors knew we needed lots of ceremonies, lots of rituals and teachings. And so I'll just share really briefly, I'm in a language immersion program because I have to reconnect and awaken the language that's in my blood because I was born Anishinaabe. I speak Anishinaabe Mowin spiritually, but physically here, I didn't learn it because my dad went to residential school and my mom went to Indian day school. And so the keeper of the language is a spirit that's yellow. So I have a yellow tobacco tie here, and I have this little being, which is a teapot. It's my little friend that sits by my desk here. And this is in honor of Aja Benegisik, who is the bird, the being that we are in relation with that keeps our language. So for me, healing from trauma has been about learning my language. And it's so beautiful to be in an immersion space because I feel like that's truly the most, if you want to say, decolonized space I've ever been in. I've been in ceremonies and the ceremonies are in language, in our Anishinaabe language, but I don't speak that fluently. And that really encodes how we are making sense of the world and how to think in that language. So my offer is, sometimes we don't even realize the hurt that we feel until the medicine makes an appearance. The mushki ki shows up and we say, oh, I didn't know I needed this. And then you also feel that healing, and especially embodied healing. All of our ceremonies are really physical. You have to experience that. If you go into a sweat lodge on a fast for 4 days and nights. So all of those are deep physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental experiences. And if you're in balance, that's where you really feel healing, when those are in balance. So you can be very physically well and not have any diseases, but be spiritually and emotionally out of balance. And that's how I think our ancestors would probably look at this English word trauma if they heard it, and they would say, oh, so that's, out of balance. That's what you're talking about. Language.
Thank you for that. The importance of somatics, of body work, of collective, of honoring language and culture and identity. That's something that we heard many times. So thank you for offering that.
Catherine, can I just pipe in super quickly? I was just going to say that I think that also speaks to the semantics and words, right? And not everybody's going to talk about trauma and use the word trauma. So I feel like, I just think it's important to throw that out there and remember that, that's not the word that everybody uses, right? So I think that's really interesting, this idea. And I think someone put it in the chat, like sometimes you don't even know what's wrong, right? To repeat what Melanie said, because I think it's something that we also talked about before this gathering today, Catherine, just to think about kind of how do we establish a language of sorts across cultures and languages that we can understand, and understand, and knowing that we use different words for pain, for trauma, for healing, and express it in different ways.
Can I add to that, actually, just to add to that, that's so important, the terminology we use. Unfortunately, a lot of the research has come from global north to study global south or other like communities, and they use words that do not relate to who we are and how we say it, whether it's culturally, language, or to be ingrained in the local community. And so when we do research, we sometimes really don't grasp what's happening because we use those very surgical terms that don't relate to the reality. And what we're trying to do is to introduce new methods of capturing the mindsets of the local community, how they express it, what does it mean to them, and then present it in a way that others can understand, giving agency and ownership to the people who are experiencing the quote unquote trauma. And then that goes for all types of behavior, whether we're talking about resilience or empowerment. What does it mean from their perspective so that we can develop better tools to understand what they're going through and how we can help, how effective is the healing itself. And we can't know that if we don't use the right terminology to measure it. So thank you for bringing that up. It's like, how do we decolonize the language so we can understand from the people themselves in their own words?
Yeah, and as some of the social change leaders we talked to said, sort of when do you lead with trauma and when would that be totally counterproductive? And so that's not even, how you open the conversation, right? And you're leading with something else entirely and sensing into, as you said, sort of what's appropriate in each context. We're going to shift gears in just a moment and do another round, peel back the next layer of the onion and tell stories. And before we do, if you'll permit me just a couple of slides, as Alexis mentioned, we at the Collective Change Lab, sort of we are a lab and we're really trying to bring a sort of a systems lens, if you will, to this discussion. How does this, and I do need a screen sharing, Bryce, but how is this related to our work and to what we're trying to achieve as system change leaders? And so 3 quick messages, sort of first is looking at trauma through a systems lens helps us to grapple with complexity and resist the temptation, right? To sort of, that's an event, a single cause. So what we might see as an individual expression of trauma may in fact be at least partly collective and intergenerational in origin, okay? So in other words, we're all carrying different pieces and different layers of trauma to varying degrees. And a second, kind of insight or reflection, how does this apply to systems, is that, of course, a longer expanded time horizon, right? Longer time scales are really integral to a systems view. And that helps to explain why unresolved and unhealed trauma from the past contributes to the stuckness, or stuckiness of our systems today. It's because these layers, again, layering is something that came up over and over again. Of different types of trauma live on as an ongoing process in our bodies, in our minds, and also in our ways of relating. So they're not in the past, they're affecting how we're experiencing the present moment. And third, sort of the systems, people will say it's not the parts, it's the relationship between the parts, right? So it's not the individual actors, it's the relatedness and the relationships between the actors in the system. And what is it that trauma damages? It hinders, it impedes our ability to relate to others with empathy and compassion. So bringing that systems lens onto trauma helps us sort of see the imperative of healing relationships between system actors as a key to changing a system's behavior. So that's just a little, kind of systems sprinkled in. And with that, I'm going to turn back to the speakers for the yarn to kind of ground some of these messages and breathe life into them through story. So if you'd like to weave your own personal stories into the yarn, a couple of prompting questions might be, why is it important to ground this conversation at the level of the self? Is there anything you'd like to share from your own trauma healing journey with those here today? Or maybe there's a shift in awareness that has been catalyzed by a healing process that, for an organization or a collective or a community that you're a part of. So anything that you would like to offer in terms of a story from your work or life to help land some of these framing messages. And I don't know who from the would like to start. Natalia, was that your hand?
Yeah, I'd love to start. Thank you. I think I see most everything as a story. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about time because I want to grab the thread from the yarn of decolonializing language. And what I feel has been one of the hardest things to decolonialize in what Rana called this global north to global south, framing of the whole work has to do with time and indicators and the immediacy that we're all experiencing with the internet and social media and how everything needs to be so quick and so immediate. And in your slide, Catherine, you mentioned it takes time to heal systems. And yet, I think all of us here who do work with systems have had to put up a proposal where we set up a time frame and a schedule and some variables and indicators. And Rana's also an investigator that's been measuring impact. And I just want to bring to the table how difficult it's been to slow down and stop and not feel pressured by this need for an immediate observable change in terms of positivistic, colonialistic, sometimes variables, right? So what I'd like to offer, and I don't know if this qualifies as a story or not, is we need to take that step and just allow for change to emerge in the time that it'll take to emerge. And we need to start shifting the categories in which we measure that change, the time frames in which we measure that change, and maybe even the need to measure so much and to have immediate results. Because really, once we release that, the tension that time brings, and for me, it's a personal physical tension that I feel like here, like in the yi, like right here, the rush of having to deliver something on time and not allow the system to come together in its own time, just as it comes together in its own language, in its own words. So my offering to you would be, let's all think together about new ways of seeing systems change and collective change projects so that we're not tied to that tight framework of rushing and immediacy and time. Thank you.
I'd like to share a story that builds on that, and that's personal, yet I think it's everywhere around the world. I was part of a project because we're studying epigenetics and what is the impact of trauma and how it crosses generations. And we interviewed Syrian grandmothers who had been pregnant during the war in 1980. And then now their granddaughters who, when they first got married, they were told that don't have children now because, they moved from Syria to Jordan and they said, don't have children because the consequences of that or whatever, but they were safe. And by mistake, of course, when their granddaughter got pregnant and she had a baby. Now the family was living in one room the grandfather who had just come out of a torture prison, all the family, they didn't have money, they didn't have food. Most importantly, they didn't have hope. They didn't know where they were going. And then suddenly this baby came, and it made the whole difference. Suddenly they were smiling, suddenly they were laughing, suddenly there was hope that there's something else. Every day they're looking, that the new tooth, the first step, the first word. And the impact of healing on trauma and experience, it cannot be calculated compared to instead delivering a mental health program that costs so much, and there's not enough psychiatrists to actually do it. And when there's so many things, we evolved as a species to deal with trauma. We've been through trauma all the time. We've been around for 200,000 years. And yet we thrive and we flourish. So how do we learn from that ancient wisdom of how we deal with trauma? How do we go forward without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel or come up with fancy, intricate programs that cost a lot of money? Not to say that, yes, there are certain situations where you need intense, but across the spectrum, you can do a lot of preventive stuff by just listening to what the people want to do as basic human beings. And to me, that was a lesson about agency, about trust, about a person going through trauma, or a community or a society, to listen to them, what they need, what they want, and to support them in the way they need and they want. And that story, to me, I'll never forget that. And I always say it, that we need to listen and hear, not just listen, but hear what people want, and allow them, not allow, even look, the terminology we're using is so wrong, for them to lead, and we are behind them, supporting them in the way they want.
I can jump into the yarn and share a story. I have an image. So I come from an oral culture, and we have very high context language, and I find myself in the time of panels and things trying to tell really elaborate stories in a very short amount of time. So I find visuals really help, and I want to share this visual here. I'd recently finished a PhD program in social and ecological sustainability. And so I was introduced to things like ecological economics, and I was reading all kinds of scholarship about Mother Earth and Gadina Windeman, my relatives, as, commodified natural resource. How do we, assign a value to a tree when that tree is grandmother cedar and grandfather birch, and the medicines? How do we assign values to these? And so it was very disturbing for me to read all of that. And so I went on my own journey and spent a lot of time in ceremony with elders and language speakers. But I also brought in, and I was really fortunate to have some support from some philanthropists who said, how would we tell that story? And so they said, well, you need to work with a human-centered design firm. And then we brought in a young Anishinaabe artist to help. And some of you may have seen this image before, but it really shifted my state of consciousness. I mean, that's what happens in ceremony and ritual. But when you're in an academic setting, you're reading and writing, and you have to write, a dissertation. And I had played with, dancing with the rhythm of trying to offer a cross-cultural experience in writing in English before, in a paper I wrote where I spoke with Mohawk elders and presented it in a Turo visual code to honor the Turo Wampum Belt. That's another story, but this story is about how, if I could, I would have submitted this as my entire dissertation, this image here. And of course, I couldn't do that. I had to submit, 200 pages and citations and etc. But what I wanted to share with you here is I had been kind of attached to creating a model or a framework for addressing complexity, which included understanding healing self and systems, because it's so important. And I heard an elder recently say, the most unselfish thing you can do is heal yourself and heal others. And it's a very collective experience. Many of our ceremonies are collective. Even if we go out on the land by ourselves, when we come back, we sit around the fire and share what we learned. So these are the 7 beings in the language I met: Bawajaganin, Bishabo, Manituke Wanan, Ishkode, Naweaki, Ashkabewasug, and Mashkiki One. They're in English on the left there. Dreams, medicines, tea, ceremonies, fire, the middle ground, the space between our lodges or our campfires, and helpers. The human beings who are helpers, the Ashkabewasug, the Shkabes, the traditionally trained apprentice.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Would you mind muting? Oh, yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Go ahead, Melanie.
Thanks. And so there's a lot of metaphor. So I know that if English is your second language, the metaphor doesn't translate easily, but this was a physical experience of walking in the woods. I moved home here about 1.5 years ago to Kitigan-Zibi, and I was hosting people on Zoom. I take you for walks in our ceremonial grounds, to our fasting lodges, to the sweat lodge, and then I would sit around the fire and I would yarn with elders and bring people into that experience. And so this ended up being the story that I've shared, Nagani Minigowiziwin. Nagani Minigowiziwin means we give these gifts to the future, and it's how Eleanor Skeed and Bert Landon, first language speakers and elders back home in Treaty 3, that's how they redefined systems transformation. You know, I was studying complexity and systems things, systems thinking, systems change. And as I described that, they said, oh, you're talking about the love you have for the beings of the future and how you're clearing a pathway. And then Eleanor dreamt of me, that I was clearing a pathway, and then I fell down and the branches scratched my arms, and she said, you have to get up. So tell people that are, you know, pursuing systemic transformation, systems change, trying to make the world a better place. Tell them they might fall down, they might get scratched and hurt, but that they need to persevere, and that there are helpers that will help them, that they can find their own helpers. And the important teaching in this whole diagram, one was that I needed to work with an artist to unleash my, you know, go beyond just sort of my mental cognitive intellect and move back into story, as my ancestors did with, you know, our oral culture. And we had birch bark scrolls, and you can see kind of elements of birch bark scrolls in the water there. That what we're really doing when we're talking about healing self and therefore healing systems is we're petitioning the Manadug, meaning we're asking all of our collective community, all of the seen and the unseen, the human beings, but also all the helpers, the spiritual helpers, to guide us. And that helps us be, I guess, a little less lonely on the journey, but also reminds us of the humility that we think human beings are the ones leading all of this, and we certainly play a major role. We're really big actors in what's happening all over the world, but our helpers who have always been there. So the disenchantment of the world, I think, was a really key turning point coming out of the Enlightenment for, you know, a lot of intellectual traditions just dismissed our helpers and the ways that our ancestors made sense of the world. So thank you for listening.
We give these gifts to the future. That's so beautiful. Selena, is there a story you'd like to share? Oh, you're having trouble unmuting. Okay. Well,
Sorry. Not really, Catherine. I think I just want to take in what Melanie just said. I think that's really beautiful. And I think someone in the chat, Mama Africa, I think she said something about linear and circular and deep, like the difference and the kind of the deep. I think a lot of these concepts, I'm just taking it in. So.
But let's do that. That's a wonderful prompt. So this is an invitation to spend just 1 minute. We're going to play a little bit of music and to spend 1 minute, sort of each of us, to create that spaciousness that we were talking about at the beginning and digest what we've covered so far. So maybe jot down or journal or just close your eyes and reflect on a word or a phrase or a story that is staying with you. We'll do that for, 30 seconds or a minute, and then we'd love to invite whoever feels so moved to share those reflections in the chat. And then we'll have a few minutes for comments and questions as well at the Q&A. I see, Laura, you've asked for Melanie's image. I don't think we can do that and the sound at the same time, if that's okay. And Tad, how are we doing on sound? Is that all right? Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you for that moment. Who would like to offer a word, a phrase, a concept, a story, something that just feels very present for them? We invite you to put that in the chat, and also if anyone would like to offer a comment, feel free to raise your hand as well. We're still digesting, I see. So we have Anna in the chat saying she's reflecting on Rana's comments about amplifying silenced voices, and Melanie's reflections on bringing different and nurturing different ways of knowing and being. Beautiful. Other comments, questions, reflections? Maybe keep them coming. Oh, question around the disconnection from self and how this reinforces the disconnection of how we rely on numbers and quantifiable indicators. Right, and Mike is reflecting on communication across difference in language and culture. Yeah, beautiful, Laura. Bringing agency and sacredness to the path we're walking together. Thank you for that. Well, let's shift gears in the remaining, just under half an hour that we have together to really dig deeper into healing. And I think it was already referred to or mentioned by Rana, this assumption in at least much of the Western world that trauma healing, right, is individual. A lot of people think it should happen, in private, maybe in a, therapist's office. And of course, that's appropriate in some circumstances. And yet what we're seeing and trying to point to is, that these other layers, this in acknowledging and addressing historical, collective, intergenerational dimensions of trauma. When we don't acknowledge that, kind of this individual therapeutic model, we're essentially asking people to heal from systemic, to heal individually from what are systemic and collective wounds. And what we're also learning from and hearing about from social change leaders is that this collective dimension of trauma requires a collective context for healing. We heal most deeply through others and in community with others. And some organizations are really starting to tap into the healing power of relationships and experimenting with different methods and approaches and integrating them into their ways of working. So as we, continue the yarn and to peel back the next layer, the question I have for our speakers today is, what if we thought about, the work of systems change, not so much as fixing what's broken, but as creating the conditions, for healing and for restoration. And so I don't know if there's, a story of collective healing or specific practice that you would like to share from your work, or maybe more like principles and ingredients to strive for. And Melanie, that was just such a beautiful visual. You might want to share that again. I think one of the other themes that came up is, sort of traditional ways of knowing, religion and spirituality and healing and its healing power. So it's just, I invite us to now dig a little bit deeper on healing and collective healing, and to share sort of stories from your context and from your work. Rana,
I'll start. I'll start. So I want to share from the program that we developed together with the community, We Love Reading. And it's about, we train women, men, and youth how to read aloud in their native language, to read stories to children that are from the local context in a local space of their choice, because they know their community better than anyone else. And what we've learned from that, many things, but in the context of this meeting in particular, what we've learned is that this has spread, the program has spread like a good virus into 65 countries. And the reason is, it's not the spreading of the reading, it's the spreading of the shift in mindset. Most of these volunteers are women, and these women, when they read aloud to the children, they literally find their voices by reading in their own language, not another language, from their own cultural stories, but also figuratively becoming leaders in their community, looked up to by the community as people who are solving problems of their local community. Now, we didn't realize at first how healing that was for the women themselves, how empowering it was, because suddenly they assumed a leadership role, they had a purpose, and they were coming up with the solutions for their community, using the reading as a stepping stone, because it's so easy to gather kids and read, but then you start thinking, oh my God, if I can do that, what else can I do? And we did some research on them. We did a randomized control trial to try to understand what is going on. And we found out that their life satisfaction went up and their sense of well-being just by little actions. And to me, that's the connection between systems change and local change. The way system change will happen is when you do it one step at a time. So these women are changing their own communities one step at a time, one sustainable development goal at a time, that will eventually collectively come together like multiple vectors to do systems change, but it's driven from the bottom up, from the proximate leaders, as we like to call them, and catalysts. And I think that's the lesson learned. We always come from a capitalistic, the for-profit world when we think of ourselves as social entrepreneurs or social innovators, that we have to get a program that scales. And it's really just trusting the people to figure out what works for them. But we can nudge, like we nudge with the reading. And I think that's what I wanted to share, that for those who develop programs, to do it with the people on the ground to develop their own programming. And then what are those universal values that can be shared across the world? And it's about scaling the mindset, the shift in mindset. And if we do that, every person feels responsible, then you've solved a lot of the problems for generations to go. And maybe I'll end with a sharing of a saying by Prophet Muhammad, since I bring in my culture and religion as a Muslim, that everyone is a guardian, right? Has a responsibility to themselves, to their local community, and their wider circles. And if we all think of ourselves as that, to take upon responsibility rather than blaming or waiting as victims to be saved. And I think that framing is so important, not just for governments to understand, international NGOs to understand, but the people themselves and the education system to understand that you can be the change maker.
Thank you for that, Rana. Yeah, and I see in the chat also, that's resonating, this question of scale, right? Trying to design something that scales rather than diffuse, mindsets and through relationships. Yeah, thank you for bringing that.
Thanks,
Selena.
Ron. I type in, Catherine. Yeah, I think one thing I also, thanks, Ron. I totally hear you. We've seen this very similar. Like, I think people can really, once you tap into that, and I think kind of along those lines, but a little bit of a tangent is one thing that we've found really interesting in our work with trauma and mental health. And we have a program where we're working on that directly within public education, health systems, and law enforcement. And one of the things that's interesting is that we do get pushback in certain spaces, right? Like, why are you working with law enforcement when they perpetrate so much suffering and pain and violence? So I find it really interesting also that sometimes we think about healing and violence and trauma, and we sometimes leave people out, right? Because of what we perceive their role to be in their communities and their societies. And what's so when we're in a training and we're working with and having these conversations, and I would always talk to my team, of course, like everybody mentioned already earlier, these linear, like, we have to get through this, like, why is the training take so long? And they'd always push back, and they're like, it takes a long time because people want to share. And they talked without saying the circular part and the deep part. They were basically telling me, you can't shorten this. But what we've seen a lot of, and particularly with populations that do face stigma also, like, we work so much with young people, but when we work with law enforcement too, that stigma ends up really going deep into the individual, into the police men and women, who then you kind of think of yourself in the way that everybody around you thinks of you, which we see with young people too. So I think when we think about that trauma and healing, we have to remember that it's like, how do we not forget that who may be perceived as a perpetrator in the context of violence, right? There's also trauma and pain in that, and then there's also that's a person, right, within a system. So I bring that up because sometimes it's like this work with perhaps unlikely populations, or populations that shouldn't be brought into this, or at least that's sometimes what we hear, and we're like, well, it's still part of a community, it's still part of a population. So how do I don't know, I guess it's almost like throwing a question out there, like, how do we do a better job when we do work with populations that aren't considered to be or groups or public servants that aren't considered to be very big contributors of healing? How do we kind of bring that in a way that doesn't make other people feel upset, right? But I just wanted to bring that up because we're talking about all this, but it's also like, how do we remember that this does apply to every being, right? Like, every being can feel pain and experience the impacts of trauma and stress and want to heal. So anyway, I don't think I'm like imparting any wisdom. I'm just sharing that because that's something that we've gone through for years now, working with both young people and communities that are impacted by the perpetuation of violence, the excessive use of force. But we felt that if we also didn't work with, these other groups like law enforcement, it was going to be really tough. So I'm just putting that out there also.
And I think it's a great question. And Natalia, I'm sure there's a lot of resonance with the work that you're doing, reintegrating ex-combatants in Colombia's armed conflict. So I know you're resonating with what Selena's saying. Is there anything you'd like to share?
Can someone mute me just in case I can't mute myself? So sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's one of the biggest and most delicious challenges that we face at Duna. And I see that Ana Hurtado is here with us. I don't know if maybe she'd like to tell a story on how you can bring this shared humanity in a circle with so many different and formally opposing actors from the system. Anita, in just 2 minutes. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm in a very loud place, so I can hear, but I don't know if it's going to be very disturbing for everyone in the background.
Okay, so I'll take it up then. Sorry, we hadn't talked before, but I just saw that she was there, and as one of our most experienced facilitators in Colombia, she's been leading restorative circles with former combatants, their direct victims, the police and armed forces that were involved in fighting them, and the government, and so many other actors sitting together in the same room. And she's had such fantastic experiences that I would have loved for her to share directly. But one of the most striking examples comes from a town, not very, but somehow close to Bogota, around 4 hours away by land. It's called Biota. We had ex-combatants reintegrated into the same communities where they were perpetrators back in the armed conflict. And we were having very difficult coexistence with the direct victims and with the armed forces as well, because they kept going up into the mountains where they used to fight, because they had this entrepreneurship of an ecological path that they wanted to share with tourists. And I think one of the most striking reconnecting examples is precisely how seeing each other's stories, their vulnerabilities, sharing the vulnerabilities, created this very deep connections between these very different actors. And now they are entrepreneurs together. So we have cooperatives of victims and ex-combatants that are supported by the local government economically, and that the security of the entrepreneurship is taken care of by the police and the army. And these were people who were present in these circles that were masterfully facilitated by Anita and our team. And there's so many tools that they use them. It's obviously complex work, but in the end, it's this theme that has run through the conversation of how to reconnect in our shared humanity and our shared placeness, our shared land, because we are having to live together in Colombia, in Biota in this case, after everything that happened. So it is possible, I guess, that our message from the story is it is difficult. You will have to make space for very difficult conversations, for very difficult emotions that will need to surface in the circle and that you will need to transit. But then connection emerges, and what comes after is so beautiful. These people just doing business together after everything that happened is I think remarkable. So it's a ray of hope for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Melanie, are you feeling, is there a story that you feel moved to?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very recent story. So maybe that's why I feel moved. I'm very excited about it. And so as, someone who studied systems and complexity, and in Canada, it's sometimes referred to as social innovation, but I was particularly interested in decolonizing complexity. And then graduating from school, I have good relationships with different philanthropists. But I always found that the structural nature of, a nonprofit, social finance and returns on investment and all these types of things was not like a really healthy space for me. And then I've had philanthropists reach out to me, and I do work with a number of philanthropists. And so maybe that's, I'm really privileged to just get to meet them in the first place, but who are open to emergence and open to we don't need key performance indicators. Like there's a trust relationship there and actually a concern deeply for my well-being. I'm in a relationship right now that's funding some work. But what I love about that type of relationship is that I was offered some resources last year to focus on narrative change and storytelling. And I thought, oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, we'll bring in, some Indigenous artists here. But at the same time, I had an email from a community that said, we're from social workers in Northern Ontario. And so we're dealing with the opioid crisis. We have a very huge opioid crisis in our communities. Fentanyl, in addition to the other challenges some of our communities face as a result of settler colonialism. And at the same time, I'm working with a group in California on harm reduction. And the two common patterns within those groups that I'm working with is stigma. The stigma that society has towards people with addictions and unhoused peoples, that we've, effectively abandoned our most vulnerable peoples because there's some system that's supposed to be taking care of that. And in fact, if you do really well with harm reduction, which is medically assisted treatment and other things, then some counties will pull your funding because there's a politicization of whether or not we should be giving naloxone kits and safe injection sites, etc. So that's going on in California with the group I'm working with. And then this other group up north was we were burying someone every week, losing them to addictions. And so I thought, well, bring together the storytellers and the social workers with those resources. And I couldn't have predicted that in some type of a grant application, nor could I predict how I would write a report back to funders. But it was beautiful to bring together social workers and storytellers. So I invited artists, and we got together twice last year in person on the land. We went into ceremony. And what's come out of that is a grassroots group called the Red Teapot Collective. And so I showed you in my photograph tea, Nabish Abo, or Minakwe Nabish, which is the leaf that we drink, that the elders love having tea and they love visiting. And so the Red Teapot Collective, this is just quickly what I wanted to share, is often, traumatized, especially intergenerational trauma. We in turn traumatize each other, through shame. You get language shamed. You get shamed because you're just learning your identity or your culture. And the elders will say, you have to know who you are to know where you're going. And then we'll hear in our own communities, we have to speak the language if you really want to know how our ancestors thought about the world. But at the same time, where are we learning that? We're not learning that in formal structures. So for me, being part of a language immersion program has been so healing, like one of the most healing things, because I've always just known how to say words, but I've never understood the spirit of what those words mean and the spirit of the language. And now I'm feeling that. But the Red Teapot Collective comes from one of the elders and language speakers who's in our storytelling group, which is part of the storytelling initiative through the Collective Change Lab as well. We're affiliated. Two of them are fellows right now. And this focus on narrative change, what I love about the Red Teapot is that one of the elders is on TikTok, and she's a second language speaker. And it's her story to share the details. But she was kind of not felt welcome in a space where there was a lot of language being used and spoken. And there's a difference between language dropping and shaming and then just language use, right? Like we love to hear the language, but sometimes people will shame others, like as if they're more Indigenous. And as an educated person, someone might think I'm not very Indigenous because I'm highly educated, or I'm not Indigenous enough for this group and I'm too Indigenous for this group. So you're always sort of like what do they call it? Code shifting or something like that. So the Red Teapot Collective is grassroots. I just decided to just launch it. And then another funder approached me and I said, working with artists is so beautiful to understand a shift in consciousness. And so I heard from the language instructor that the way that we learn best is immersion, but also through apprenticeship. So I decided last night, hey, why don't we fund apprenticeships so that you can spend time with elders. And so I was on a call with 2 language speakers last night, had my first conversation in Ojibwe with one of the language speakers, which was like, you know, more than that PhD back there was, wow, I had a genuine conversation, like, hi, how are you? And so I think that that's part of, you know, what we need to recognize is that you cannot predict in many ways how the healing is going to happen and who's going to be able to do it. But just to share, yes, that, you know, having an understanding and that it's collective. And so when I joined this immersion program, and there's some young people in there and some young moms, you know, they're sitting there with their babies and they're trying to say the words, you know, it was so beautiful for all of us to share our stories about why we don't speak our language fluently, because we know it's settler colonialism and it's residential school, but it's also difficult to find spaces that are safe where you can be with each other and stumble over the words, you know. So that's the elder that does the TikTok videos. She loved having tea with us. We were teaching her a little bit about different types of tea. And so she now records videos with language speakers, and she offers them a cup of tea from a red teapot. And so we're really focused on visiting. And so that's what I wanted to share, that the elders, we've come together, we had some funding, but the outcome of it is that we need to bring back how to visit in our communities. We need to visit our elders, we need to visit with our young people, and we need to bring them together to have visits and to speak in Anishinaabe, even if they only know one word.
So beautiful. Mulaney, thank you so much for sharing that, you know, sort of leaning into emergence. You know, it's never formulaic, and it is collective. We're approaching the end of our time together. I just want to build very briefly on what you shared. This is an incomplete list, but it is a starting point of a set of principles that we've heard over and over again that can contribute to collective healing. And the first, as you just shared, was traditional language and cultural identities. Embodiment practices have also been spoken about. Dancing, somatic work, the sharing that comes, the connection from circles, healing circles, peacemaking circles. They go by lots of different names. We've also talked about the healing power of nature and the power of stepping into and telling our stories. And we've experienced rituals. So we're not only talking about it, we're trying to also create experiences. And with that, knowing that we're very close to the end of our time together, I'd love to both invite anyone to help us add and expand that list. And also, I would like to invite you, Natalia, to lead us in just a short, very brief closing ritual as we experience a last moment of togetherness, and then say goodbye and go on to the rest of our days.
So can I share one thing to add to what you listed and to
Yes,
kind of form what was spoken? I think one thing we need to think as we think of healing and systems change is that we don't want to fix a system that's broken, because the problems came because of a wrong system. So you can't fix it using the wrong system. And it's about reimagining a new way, a new system based from the people. What does that mean? How do we take all that we're talking about today, not as an exception, but for this to become the mainstream? This is what academia should work on. This is what government should work on. This is what nonprofit organizations should work on. Not just an exception, a nice cherry on the top, but to be the guideline. How do we do that, right? How do we remove the labels that shame us or put us in boxes that we're used to control and to make it different? And maybe the last thing here is, how do we ensure that we don't repeat these discrimination and all the challenges we're going through IT, through artificial intelligence? We can't deny it's there. It's coming for the next generation. How do we make sure that it doesn't control us, but we control it? How do we make sure we're all involved as we set up those databases and those data sets and the algorithms, that they really equally represent who we are. So these are things to ponder and think about, and for us to reimagine what are our individual roles in making a difference. And I will end remembering that it's not about you have to be overwhelmed because you have to change the whole system. No, it's about what can you do today within your circle, within this hour, and think as small as that. And then if you do, we'll change the world together. That's the chaos theory in physics. When a butterfly flutters its wings in one part of the world, there will be a hurricane beyond time and space that we can imagine. So never underestimate the power of one person and one word.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much, Rana, for that. So Natalia, please close us out. I know we're at time and people need to jump to their next thing, but it would be wonderful to have a moment of togetherness with you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And the exercise that I'm about to offer is something that I would like to invite you all to practice every time you have meaningful conversations, every time you sit and visit with your community and your elders. And it's an exercise for making space for the bundle that Melanie told us at the very beginning that we'd be carrying from, this conversation, all this richness that we've received. Becomes our bundle, and it's part of our interbeing. Every time we listen to each other, our channel patterns are changed by the words that we listen to. And it also has to do with what Rana just said in closing. Our interdependence is contained in each and every word that flows out of us. So because of that, we need to make space in our bodies for that new information, for those new channels and patterns to emerge in ways that will be the most useful to each of our communities. So please close your eyes if you feel comfortable closing your eyes. If not, you can just leave them open. And try to locate within your body where, all this information and all this richness is resting. Are you feeling some tensions in your yi, in your solar plexus, or maybe butterflies in your throat you want to speak, or maybe you're feeling some heaviness from the information, or you're feeling lighter with hope. Where are you feeling, the emotions of having heard all of what has been said? Take a deep breath. And just send air to that space in your body where this information is being stored. With each breath, visualize each and every cell of your body opening up for this new information that has come to you, for these new emotions, for these new feelings, for the spirits of everyone who has been here and shared collectively with us. Make room for all of that in each of your cells. Visualize your cells expanding infinitely to hold a space for all of it. All of our humanity fits in each of our cells. And we expand them through our breaths, each of our cells. With the final inhalation, make a wish and visualize this information expanding and resonating outwards to other sentient beings around you and to yourself, your personal history. How is this going to help me and others and my land connect? final inhalation and exhalation to visualize all of us doing the same thing and at the same time and connecting through our breath. Inhale. Hold as if you can, and then exhale. Together. Together. You can open your eyes now if you have them closed. Thank you so very much for listening, for making space in your channel patterns for this interaction, for this interdependence. And we hope that it'll resonate upwards to yourselves and your communities. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much. I know we're over time, so I would just like to honor all of our speakers and everyone present here. It's the beginning of a journey, and we hope you'll walk that journey with us. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Bye, everyone.